Hello and welcome to Critical Thinking, and here we are on Module 10 already, Inquiry and Interpretation. Now this set of slides is going to basically piggyback and scaffold onto everything we've been looking at so far, because it sounds like we keep going over the same terrain, and yes, in a general sense we are, but each time we kind of do a deep dive into certain aspects and ideas about reading, researching, thinking critically, writing critically, that writing thinking model that we were talking about way back in the very beginning. Well, really that's all we're going to be doing, is just going back and always revisiting that same model. And so for this week, we're just going to think about inquiry, right? Looking into something, right? If we look into something, we're inquiring. We want to find out something. A doctor will inquire into a medical condition. As a fire investigator, you're going to look into a particular matter relating to a fire. You're looking at evidence. You want to figure out what's going on. A scientist can inquire into something. We inquire in a variety of different ways, but what we need to do is to understand what that actually means, right? We don't come in with preconceived ideas or with a finished product in mind. We want to keep our options open. So when we look into something, we inquire into something, we want to see just what it is that is intriguing us in the first place. What can I learn from this? What can I know, right? What is the knowledge that I am looking for? And that would be probably as far as you want to go in terms of preparing for trying to investigate something. So inquiry is certainly something that we do on a regular basis, on a every day, school, work, and so on. It certainly is part of academic learning. You inquire into something to collect a body of knowledge. You're presently now probably, if not, believe you're in second year. So you're at least halfway through collecting a body of knowledge about fire prevention and fire safety. And you're collecting this information, and you probably have been able to test it, look at case studies, look at peer-reviewed reports, and all these things work together to create these truth claims that you can make to people regarding a particular subject matter. And in your case, fire safety and fire prevention. Now, we make statements all the time, and we don't stop to think about what they actually mean or what the statement broken down is implying. And let's take something very, very simple that we've said for many, many years. Something like, Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. Okay, so we make a statement. There is consensus that this occurred. I personally don't know or did not ever meet Christopher Columbus, but I trust the historians. But let's look deeper into a simple statement like that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. Okay, you can then break it down and say, well, there's a whole range of different things that we can sort of inquire into, right? We can think about, well, what kind of calendars were they using back then? I don't know if you remember, first of all, there was the millennial change from 1999 to 2000. We survived that. And then in 2012, there was a fear that it was going to be the end of the world. The Mayan calendar was implying that the end was near. People were, selling off their investments and panicking and looking to see if they could live in caves, and et cetera, et cetera. Point is, we were using a different calendar. The Mayan calendar is not one that we use now. In the same way, the calendar that Christopher Columbus was using may or may not correspond with what we consider to be 1492. Because again, calendars are arbitrary. We started collecting, or we started to count down time before and after the birth of Christ. It was BC and then AD. So even something as simple as a discovery in a certain date. Well, what calendar were you using? Was it a Spanish calendar, a Mayan calendar, a North American calendar? Well, it can't be North American because he just discovered it, right? So, I'm being facetious here, but you get the point. The more problematic issue is the word discover. Okay, so he discovers a piece of land that already has people on it. Well, it's not like they discovered those people the same day. All Christopher Columbus did, and in fact he kind of screwed up, he thought he was heading east when in fact he was heading west. So there's another problem. So the interpretation of the word discover really becomes problematic when we talk to different people. Indigenous nations, for example, don't even think of Christopher Columbus discovering anything. They were already here, right? They knew already where they were. There was no discovery. or even the idea of discovering America. Well, if you discover something right off the bat, last time I checked, it wasn't called America right then and there. It was a chunk of land that was actually mistaken. There was, first of all, traveling up along the east coast, the American seaboard, landing in small remote islands, and thinking that this was America. You get my point. The fact is, we make statements all the time without really kind of stopping and inquiring, are these truth claims valid? Are we using the right calendar? Are we using the right interpretation of discover, the right term America? Well, were there other people that arrived there first? Did we or do we even acknowledge the Viking history that clearly is there? We know that we see remnants around the world of Vikings traveling literally around the world. So did Christopher Columbus discover America allegedly first? Not likely, for a whole range of reasons that I've just pointed out. So when we are looking into the world, we're searching for reality, we're trying to understand what's going on, we are moving around in this kind of interesting little diagram here between experience, right? Experiencing the physical world. This is firsthand knowledge, direct experience that we have. Then we start moving further away from that towards, hypotheses. I think the following is occurring, and now I shall test it to see if it's correct. From that, if you make, let's say, half a dozen tests that conclusively support your hypothesis, now you can make a prediction, and you can start deciding whether or not this truth claim that you are making that used to be a hypothesis is now in fact the truth. It's now an idea, a theory, a formula. You could also go towards the notion of abduction, right? We talked about that last month, where you have a state of affairs, a problem, a situation, and then again, you use hypothesis to interpret what's going on. The example we had was a body that we find on the floor. Was this person murdered? Did they die of natural causes? Was it suicide? Was any number of things? So you hypothesize, and then you start to investigate, but you're always inquiring into this condition that you find something in. So what we accept as fact or as truth is still a kind of interpretation, because at one point we thought the earth was flat, then we thought it was floating in a body of water, and at one point the church told us that the earth was still and the sun rotated around it. These truth claims, sure, that's what they are, but they're always open for interpretation. And so these truth claims, for sure, are ways for us to understand the world as we know it and as we experience it. And there is at least a degree of predictability in saying this statement makes sense because this kind of bodes well with my experience of understanding the laws of gravity or natural law. Right now, we can say more or less that the winter is done. We're now in spring, and we're assuming, right? I'm assuming that the flowers begin to bloom and the grass is not going to be kind of all white and gnarly, but in fact, they're going to start to turn slightly green and everything's going to start to grow. But things could change, right? Any number of things could change. So even though it is a truth claim that I'm making, things could still go wrong. Things could still develop in a different way. So whatever truth claim I make, I need to be able to defend the particular interpretation that I have made of it. So knowledge on any given topic depends on who is doing the interpreting and whether the data is of interest to people in a particular situation. So when you are thinking about a statement like Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492, this is now taught in history books as a truth claim. This actually happened. But as I've just pointed out, there's a whole range of issues that are secondary that have to do with perspective, social class, political affiliation, your own lived experience. If you are a member of an indigenous community in North America, your idea of Christopher Columbus and the encroachment of Western civilization upon your land is of a completely different type than us showing up and, look, we discovered something. Well, thanks, we're already here, right? We're good. So when we are inquiring into something, we're trying to investigate the conditions in which we find this thing. We try to, create a scenario in our minds. We certainly are open to discussion with other people, just to at least confirm that what we're thinking of is in fact correct. We need to reflect on that discussion and on the investigation, because that's where that critical inquiry comes in. We start thinking about the facts that we've collected. We kind of test them. We look to see, well, how many of these are facts and how many of these are just a hypothesis? And then we need to also think about ourselves and our position in terms of what we would like to believe, because we have prejudices and biases of one sort or another. We'd like something to be the way it is. And if we inquire in a truly critical way, we try to the best of our abilities to set aside those biases and those prejudices and that desire to already have the answer. If you already have the answer, then inquiry is going to be rather useless, because you kind of already know the answer. So what you want to do is do it with an open mind. Now, when you are working in high school and in college, you're writing a research paper, and a research paper usually is informational. I don't think at any point anyone in either high school or college will expect you to go out and do first-hand inquiry, conduct interviews with people, go out on the field and do certain things. That costs a lot of time and it costs a lot of money sometimes. And once you get that information and you inquire into something, then you've got to reshape it and reformulate it into a sort of presentation. That's a lot of effort. So typically in high school and in college, you're writing informational papers, but at the very least, you still need to inquire into your sources. And I've talked about this at length, the biases that are inherent in the sources themselves. If we're looking for information and the only source we have is Facebook and YouTube, we're in trouble. We're really in big trouble, because we don't have really anything to measure it against, right? In fact, typically with these two sources in social media, is that it becomes a kind of bubble. And because of algorithms, we're algorithm to death. And the end result is we simply see reflected back more information that is very similar. So there's no critical inquiry. It's more confirmation. And when you have nothing but confirmation of the first idea that pops into your head, that's not inquiry anymore. That's simply confirming. So research itself is not the goal of inquiry, right? It's the thinking that we do before and after gathering the sources. So we go out with our open mind. And I stressed this even in our previous class in ethics. When you are doing your paper, if you find a paper that maybe contradicts or at least takes the idea that you have, right, because you just have a hypothesis and takes it in a different direction, don't dismiss that paper outright. Hold on to it. Identify it as not being 100% on your side. But if you leave it there and you work through your idea and you start to find suitable sources, you can always go back to that paper and see what it is that they do to change course, right? They kind of change direction, and see whether you can deal with that and say, okay, well, these people wrote this paper and yes, they come up with a different conclusion, but they did it in a very kind of selective, subjective, kind of cherry-picking information here and there that will only support their point of view. Okay, you've looked at it. You've decided how they did it. In other words, how did they get to this different conclusion? And then you've identified the critical issue, which is they were very selective. Although it appears that they were objective, they're in fact very subjective. They simply wanted to pick that information that would support their argument. That's not something you want to do. But would you include that in your paper? Absolutely. Why? Because it shows that you are willing to look, again, sorry about the metaphor, thinking outside the box, but that's what it is. You were thinking outside the box and you found something that either contravened or disagreed with your initial proposal, but you still looked at it. And you were able to identify why the conclusions were different, because that one was very subjective. It did not look at the information that you looked at. And as a result, the conclusions are different. The inquiry was different. The investigation was different. It was much more selective. So when we do this, we have to investigate and inquire effectively. We have to keep that open mind. Okay, we're not trying to prove anything either. We have an idea, right? We have this hypothesis. And this is why this kind of objective kind of thinking, rather than abduction rather than deduction or induction. Abduction is really what we're doing here at this point. We have an idea, right? That idea is fairly sound, but we're going to inquire, not to try to prove anything, but to simply, again, keep that open mind, right? We question our initial viewpoint, and we're willing to set it aside. We're willing to test it, right? So when we inquire to something, we're willing to test that hypothesis that we have of what's going on. And that's always a good thing. So we used to believe that people had common sense and were able to figure out what was going on. But guess what? At one point, common sense, of course, backed up by the church, said that, the earth was stationary, the sun went around it, and these were religious truths. And of course, religious truths are even more powerful because typically back in the time when the earth was stationary, the church also had an army, right? They had the capacity to put people to death for disagreeing with them. So would you go out on a limb and do that? Some did, and some paid for it. They were usually hanging off the end of the limb. So we want to make sure that when we inquire, we understand what common sense is. And we may have some flaky idea, but you can have a flaky idea, but you should be willing to test it and willing to turn around and say, okay, I believe the following is so. I'm going to look into it, but I'm going to keep an open mind and see whether I find more material that contradicts what I'm thinking, or it's 50-50, at which point you may have to inquire further. So if we can question our truth, sure, it might make us uncomfortable, but we have to be able to do that. Otherwise, we're not going to end up being able to debate with another person whether or not our ideas are sound. They're good. They make sense, because that's something we should be able to do. So if you think about what you've learned, you may still hold the same belief because it's been confirmed, but make sure it's confirmed in a consistent, rational kind of way. Again, don't cherry pick that information. Don't willfully ignore commentary that might contradict what you're thinking, because then you're being just as subjective as the paper that you found that seemed to contradict what you're doing, but did it in a very selective kind of way. So their inquiry was flawed because they were not looking at all the information that was there. They were being very selective. So that's not something that you want to be doing. So if you are inquiring and you're looking into something with that open mind, willing to have something disagree with you, you say, okay, if you're having a discussion, right? Let's say, discussion, debate, we'll say argument. You can ask if you've understood the arguer's position on the issue. Do you fully understand what that other person is saying? Just as important, the meaning of any words. Remember a couple of months ago, we were talking about words have various meanings in terms of context. When we say one thing, the other person listening or reading our work may understand something else. They hear the same word, but they interpret it differently. So we want to make sure the meaning of our words that are central to the argument are clear. And I've mentioned before the book that I'm working on, the first chapter, the introduction, lengthy, but you could read just that chapter and understand a lot about this group that I'm inquiring into, because I define all the terms, I unpack them, I show they connect to one another, but I always have clear definitions. So the meaning of words now are very straightforward. Before you engage in any of the secondary material, those words are all clarified. So now you're doing the same thing with the person that's listening as much as you're doing this to yourself. So you try to understand the other person's position, make sure that there's consensus on the agreement to what words mean, the reasons to support the thesis. What do these people write or say to support their main idea? Assumptions, right? What are the assumptions upon which the thesis or the reason is based on? Are these assumptions valid? Are they consistent? And also, too, the values that are expressed. If someone wants to contradict the idea, the alleged truth claim that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492, consider who they are. And that knowledge that they have, because they happen to come from somewhere else, or certainly a member of the indigenous population that's been here for many, many hundreds of years, agree with them that from your perspective, yes, the notion of discovery is almost laughable. So even if you had a truth claim that was there for most of your life, always be ready to have it changed, because that's kind of the way things are when we continue to learn things. Okay, so there's a list of questions for inquiry. Ask how all the reasons are supported. Now, those are both your own and the other person's. Consider the kinds of analogies and comparisons that you're making. Make sure that they're clear. Make sure that they're understandable. We have a lot of sports analogies in the English language, and especially in North America. And depending on where you're from, you both may be able to speak English, but maybe only one of you knows the sort of ins and outs of hockey, for example. So you say to someone, well, he was able to stick handle around the situation. What does that even mean? Or if someone says, he was working on this thing and he just dropped the ball. This person only knows cricket, right? Or they only know, I don't know, some wrestling, whatever. The point is, be careful with analogies and comparisons, because you're making an assumption that the other person understands what you're saying when in fact they may not. So we have a lot of sports-related analogies that are kind of culturally specific. We need to be very careful with those. And also comparisons, right? You've heard the expressions, it's apples and oranges as opposed to chalk and cheese, right? Chalk and cheese is that the comparison just doesn't work. It's not valid. Make sure the comparisons work and they are appropriate. Always consider the arguer's biases and backgrounds. This is something we've talked on and off in the other class as well as this one about, for example, Trump supporters. Their biases are absolutely front and center. They wear them on their sleeves and they shout them right in your face because they want things to be a certain way and angrily refuse to consider any other possibility. Well, ultimately, it's their problem. Their boy's no longer in charge. So they are at least slightly less dangerous, just slightly less. So the arguer's biases and backgrounds sometimes may not be as explicit, and we need to be very careful. And we also need to know the source, right? Where are they getting their information? Because if we can discover that, then at least we can turn around and say, well, that person may actually be convinced that this news source, let's say Newsmax, is in fact objective, when it's clear that it's not. And what you would do is you would present to that person the same news report and say, look at all the different ways you can interpret this. And so if they are at least slightly open to suggestion or, revisiting an idea, there's hope. But I would tread carefully no matter what. The other thing too with inquiry is the implications. Like, what does this mean? If your inquiry is into a fire and you have decided that this looks suspicious enough to warrant the possibility of an arson investigation, not only does that ramp it up and change the nature of the inquiry, but the implications is that you may be looking for someone to charge. You may be looking for someone that may be charged with arson. That's very serious. So you want to make sure that inquiry is done correctly. Now, ask whether the argument takes opposing views into account. I mentioned a few moments ago about the possibility of looking at another paper, for example. It could also be peer-reviewed. And inquiring into perhaps how they came up with this other conclusion that doesn't fit with yours. And then you've got to figure out, is it in the inquiry stage, the presentation stage, and then be able to take apart that argument, because you need to know why, everything else seems to make sense. It uses common sense. And yet here's this paper that kind of really is out in left field. Like, why is that? What were they looking at and how did they look at it? Because the how and why, especially the why, right? That's the inquiry. That becomes quite important because it allows us to make sense of what's actually happening. So critical thinking here, if you were to look at this model, you analyze, you infer, you evaluate, you interpret, you generate ideas, you reason them out, and you continually are doing this. And you can be moving back and forth between analysis and reason, between interpretation and evaluation. It's not a matter of being hung up. You want to move through it carefully. And quite often we're doing this, in a very short amount of time, but evaluation, interpretation, and generation of ideas, all those are very important in terms of doing the inquiry in a critical, objective manner. Because if you can do that, you end up with some pretty solid facts or truth claims that, for the time being, seem to work just fine. So you want to sort of have a look at the text, whatever it is. Let's say you're doing a case study and the teacher's asked you to, look up half a dozen sources. Well, one of the best ways to do it is to look at the abstract. And the abstract, if it's well written, will sort of encapsulate and summarize the main points. May not necessarily present its point of view. It may be implicit, but certainly the abstract at the top of that text gives you a pretty good idea of what this thing is about, what it covers, and typically it will give you its tentative conclusions. Clearly, there's more detail in the text, but that abstract should have that. It should sort of lay down the main thesis, some of the methods of inquiry, and then its tentative conclusions. So if you look at it, and it sounds like something that is going to work, then obviously you hold on to it. You put it in the yes pile, we'll say, versus the no pile. But that way, at least you know where you're going to be starting from. Okay, so when we are talking to people, we just are having conversations. We're not engaging with people sort of in a critical fashion, unless what you're doing is having an actual argument or discussion about something. The points are being made. It could be a debate, for example, about something. Because most of the time, we're simply just having a chat with people, right? We're not engaging with them critically, unless something happens to come up. And it kind of like, what? Like, why would you think that? And then all of a sudden it starts and the gears have changed a little bit. And the conversation simply now starts changing for the sake of clarity. So writers argue their opinions. An essay typically contains a thesis or claim that's explained or justified or defended with reasons to back up its evidence. That can also happen in a conversation. So instead of reading something, you're listening and you're engaging back and forth. And what you're doing is discussing and debating the merits of this new perspective, this new idea that this person has brought in. And that's absolutely worthwhile. That's something that we should learn to do. We shouldn't always accept everything that's presented to us in an uncritical fashion. So we want to make sure that we're able to do that. So the most important thing when you're working through and you're speaking to this person or reading their work is to question it. And you're not questioning it in an angry kind of way. You're doing it in a very sort of objective, disinterested, dispassionate kind of way, because you want to look to see what makes that opposing viewpoint worth considering. Maybe it's something that might eventually change your mind. So if that's the case, you want to see how that speaker or that author handles that opposing viewpoint. Is it selective? Is it cherry picking? Or is it something that is very consistent and worth looking at in more details because it contradicts your position, your perspective, but we can learn from it. So what are the benefits of learning in this way? You can problem solve. You can engage your critical thinking skills. You can think about the context in which this truth claim is generated. All these things matter in understanding the generation of knowledge, as well as the truth claim itself. How does it come about? Who is saying this? For what reason? It's not like what is their agenda, but what are the reasons, right? Because when you say their agenda, you kind of you're implying they're hiding something, and they're not necessarily doing so. You can now create new concepts, new theories, new ideas that you can transfer over to new problems. So that's always really helpful. It teaches students as well how to learn and how to self-learn. I know that I managed to get through high school and I have never used algebra or trigonometry or whatever, but what I did learn was how to learn. And I've been able to do this ever since. So if high school didn't do anything else for you, if it taught you how to learn something, then it did its job. And you just happened to spend a whole lot of time learning about stuff that you really didn't need to know about, but there it is. So if you can learn how to learn, and you can learn how to learn critically and with an open mind, that's a gift, right? That's a valuable gift that you can have for the rest of your life. And also too, you can own that inquiry, right? You can own the work that you have done because you have looked into it. You haven't just gone on YouTube and I'm doing research, click, right? You're doing more than that. Oh my God, you're reading books, right? You're reading articles. Yes, I'm being facetious, but it's true. Because otherwise, if you're just getting information from a source that is not very reliable, guess what? Your information will not be reliable. So there isn't sort of one correct way to do it. It depends on who we are, what our lived reality is, our lived experience is. But we can still be able to ask the question, what is the writer's position, right? What is it that that person is trying to express over and above the ideas that they are giving us to, or showing us to consider the truth claims, right? The position they're taking, it could be one that is implying that we're doing something the wrong way, or our political affiliations are wrong, or we're destroying the planet, and here's how we can fix that. So we're doing a whole range of things. We're thinking about an event or a situation. We're investigating into it. We're reflecting on it. And all of these things really matter in terms of being able to generate truth claims that are substantial. So, I've never had a professor that said this, but let's say hypothetically, right? A professor once advised his class, if you want to think you know something about a subject, read one book. In other words, don't go too far. Just, it's confirmed. Because reading a second one will just confuse you. And what that means is the confusion may sort of not be the right word, the right term. What happens is, as you dig a little deeper, and as you travel through school, you might get into grad school. I mean, I started at Fanshawe as well, but you end up in grad school, and your work typically is maybe an inch wide, but it tends to be about a mile deep. That's a lot of books. A mile deep is a lot of books, a lot of articles to go through. And there will be some conflicts, some contradictions, some disagreement, and that's not a bad thing. Because if you find those, you don't have to necessarily seek them out, but you will encounter them. What you need to do now is decide which sources are good and which ones are not. So you want to make sure that you don't, at the end of the day, simply go, so what, right? Who cares? Well, that's not something you want to do, especially when it comes to, climate change, political issues, economic issues that really matter to us because they really do inform and influence our daily lives. So to just come up with who cares because it's too much work, well, you might be in the wrong field, right? If that's what you're going to be doing, you want to turn around and say, okay, well, I do care. This matters, right? This matters because I need to know more. And so that response is not really the right one because at the very least, it is certainly uncritical, right? You're giving up too soon. Now, you also don't want to walk into an inquiry with a preconceived notion that is already closed, right? We cannot write history. History simply unfolds as it does. Because if you walk in looking to only endorse the position that you are taking and refuse to look at anything else, that's called self-interest. And sure, self-interest may be sometimes helpful, but it is more about your biases and your prejudices and your preconceptions. And here the term is correct, a preconception. I preconceive this to play out this way. And that's not being critical. That's simply looking for information that will confirm that bias. So if you have self-interest, it sometimes is going to work against you, right? It's not going to work in your favor because let's say you have to present this to someone and that other person has read far more books or journal articles than you have, and they can shoot down your argument pretty quickly because you've either just read one or two books that confirmed your bias, your self-interest, and suddenly the teacher says, well, what about this? And what about that? Have you considered the following? How could you include this? Oh boy. Okay, I should have read those other books. So you want to make sure that you can engage with those other arguments in a consistent way. And at the very least, know that they exist. So the better or best argument is going to emerge as we think through the arguments that we are looking at, inquiring into, considering their strengths and weaknesses, and watching to see if we can kind of tease out the manner in which they've inquired into this particular situation, this state of affairs, as we say in philosophy. The real challenge ultimately is to revise our own opinion, because an opinion is just that, right? It tends to be not backed up at this early point by truth claims and facts, right? Verifiable facts. So we want to change that opinion to something that resembles a truth claim. And you do that by wading through these various arguments that you have before you and try to make sense of all of them. Is there a consistent thread that runs through all of them? Is there some unifying thought that, at least in terms of the inquiry or the conclusions, or at least the method of presentation, is there something that ties them together? And then you keep working a little bit further. Because at the end of the day, what you want to do is make sure that you have the ability to make a valid truth claim that is going to hold water. So all of this, right, that thinking, writing model that I talked about at the very beginning, is really what this is all about. It's about having the ability to communicate, keeping an open mind, being able to problem solve, because when you are doing an inquiry into a fire, that is problem solving of the highest order, because now you're walking in after the fact. This event has already occurred. The fire is done. Might still be smoldering a little bit, but if the fire is over, you now have to begin problem solving, keeping an open mind, being creative, inquiring into something, but not with a preconceived notion, and especially analyzing the material that you find in front of you. So we need to be specific about what we've read. We need to be able to quote and paraphrase properly. We can't start cherry picking a quotation because, well, a couple words. Let's say if I take the word not out of there. Oh, this guy now can appear that he's agreeing with me. No, no, just no. It's unethical. It's immoral. If you're going to quote from someone, quote correctly and accurately. And if you're going to paraphrase, the same. Paraphrase accurately and correctly. I'm going through my rewrites and I'm double checking every one of the quotations that I use, and trust me, I use a lot. I think I have 2,000 citations, or 2,000 footnotes at least, in this 350-page book. So I need to make sure that I've properly quoted and properly paraphrased, if I do that, the statements that are being made. So when you summarize those sources, you need to make sure that you are using the ideas in that source to validate and support and underpin your main truth claim. You want to make sure that it's there because it supports it. There is a problem in grad school, for example. It's called name dropping, and although the person may not fully understand what this theorist or philosopher or sociologist is saying, it looks cool that you've dropped their name and, as so-and-so says, and then you have it there. Without really understanding fully what that person's saying, you're simply trying to you're trying to impress somebody. And you shouldn't do that. You should be able to understand thoroughly and intuitively what that statement is that is coming from that secondary source and how it supports your position. So you want to make sure that the reader understands, or the speaker, in this case, if you're speaking to someone, the speaker understands what you're saying. You want to make sure that the information is there where it is presented to the best of your ability as a truth claim, but always possible, always open to new considerations, new interpretations. So you need to be able to show how that research and inquiry refined, modified, and changed your initial opinion, because that's kind of a subjective thing, and then explain why. And the short answer to that is because I've found confirmation in peer-reviewed articles. These are people whose full-time job is to do these kinds of things, to research the very question that I raised, and I believe what they have found to be true. And the validity of my source is that it is not only peer-reviewed, but it's been around for a long time. If a truth claim has been made and it's been valid for 50 years, chances are it's pretty solid. Now, doesn't mean it's forever. It's not etched in stone, right? We don't do that anymore. But it is a fairly consistent idea that has not been disproved since. It could be in the future, of course. But for this point in time, or at this point in time, it seems pretty valid. So, when you are working through this inquiry, you want to talk about certain standards of clarity and accuracy and relevance. You want to make sure that you can do that. And those are applied to the elements. We call them the elements, the questions, the points of view, the concepts, the assumptions that are making, especially the information. So the standards must be applied to the elements as we learn to develop these intellectual traits. Now, while you're doing all of this, you should always maintain intellectual integrity. And intellectual integrity can be done as simply as citing your sources. If you don't, and somebody happens to find out that you have kind of, well, plagiarized the material, you're in big trouble. So you want to be able to maintain that kind of intellectual integrity. And you do it by citing sources. Now, you may secondarily be name dropping if somebody happens to, be a famous person in that field. But the integrity that you maintain with your paper is such that you can now cite those sources honestly and ethically because you have quoted from them properly. And guess what? If you're like me, when I read through something, I do check the footnotes. I do want to know where that came from because I'm interested. And I want to find out, oh, what was the name of that book or the author? Oh, okay, I have this book. I can look this up. Or I don't, and I'm gonna buy it. I want to look into it. So integrity and humility is very important. Fair-mindedness also is important because you want to be able to include opposing positions, but you include them in a way that you've looked at them. You haven't just simply said, well, not everybody agrees. Then you have a footnote saying, well, here's the list of the people that don't agree. That's not how it works. The way it does work is that you engage with those other positions. You find out why it's different. What did they do differently? How did they inquire differently to come up with this new conclusion? And that's essentially it. That's really not much more you can do. Now, are these things all important that I've talked about? Well, it turns out in 2020, which is only a few months into 2021, the number one skill that individuals were looking for, whether they are employers or teachers or whatever, top one, complex problem solving. That's what we're doing. Critical thinking, very much what we're doing. Creativity, right? Thinking outside the box, inquiring with an open mind. That's being creative. Thinking in a different kind of way. People management, sure, on and on it goes. So problem solving or complex problem solving, critical thinking, and creativity in 2020 were considered the top three skills that people should have. Now, in 2015, complex problem solving was also important, but notice how critical thinking dropped a little bit. And creativity was at the very bottom of the top 10. Why is that? Well, I would say first off, it's the amount of bullshit that's out there in social media, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or wherever else, where people can make sense of something. They can turn around and they can dig a little bit further and find out whether some truth claim that's been made is in fact correct. Because if you can't, at the very least, that means you're gullible. At the worst, it means you're an uncritical thinker, which now segues into the second one. So to problem solve in a creative way, in a critical way, those three skills are absolutely what you need in 2020, just to make sense of the bizarre world that we're living in right now, where everybody has an opinion on something, but really that's all it is an opinion, not backed up with a whole lot of anything. So that's essentially the lesson, about 43 minutes, so a little 3/4 of an hour or so. It's kind of sounds like what we've been doing, and it is, but this is sort of looking at just the notion of inquiry, how important it is, how to keep that open mind, how to consider alternative points of view, but look at them critically. Just don't accept them. Look at them as, how did they come to this arrangement or this conclusion? So that's pretty well it. Take care. I will see you all on Thursday. I'm going to take a look to see between now and Thursday what needs to be done for this week. We're getting pretty close to wrapping up. I think you've done at least 6 or 7 things. There's only a couple more that are left to do, but I'll take a look. And in the meantime, have a good week, and I'll see you back on Thursday.